What makes the four types of boundary encroachments different from one another? If you haven't yet, you can watch my other video where I talk about the four different types of boundary encroachments. But just to review, they are perimeter encroachments, utility encroachments, building encroachments, and access encroachments. So what makes those things different? How are they alike and not alike from each other? It's important to understand that, especially if you're going to be invested in commercial real estate or involved in commercial real estate transactions. Encroachments happen, right? You want to know how to deal with them when they happen, and your strategy for how to deal with an encroachment on a potential commercial real estate transaction is going to change depending on which of the four types of encroachments you're dealing with. So we're going to go through some of those differences and similarities. So encroachment number one, perimeter encroachment. This type of encroachment most frequently occurs when boundary management has been neglected, what I call boundary management. So what does that mean? That means the property hasn't been surveyed, or if it's been surveyed, the property corner monuments haven't been set, or the landowner has allowed encroachments to be constructed, or all three. So you might have a property that hasn't been surveyed, the monuments aren't set, and encroachments have been built across the parcel boundary. So that's the type of encroachment that we see most frequently as surveyors. So this is a fence or a wall that has been built over the property line. I was just looking at a parcel over in San Mateo in the Bay Area. The fence is built, 18 to 22 feet over the property line. It's been there a long time. So one of the other things that makes perimeter encroachments difficult is they are the most contentious type of encroachment. So of all the four types of encroachments, people tend to fight over perimeter encroachments more than any other. For something about fences and walls, people will fight over them. If you find out your neighbor's building is 8 inches over your house, over the property line, your neighbor's house, most people in that situation tend to be a little more reasonable, and they'll say, all right, we'll move a property line to fix this. But if it's just a fence or a wall, people will fight to the death over that. So they tend to be a little more contentious than the other three types. They are also, as a general rule, at least here in California, the hardest type of encroachment to legitimize through unwritten rights. In other words, our courts take a fairly dim view of people trying to acquire other people's property through a perimeter encroachment. I'm not saying that you can't do it, but it's hard to do. You can almost never get a prescriptive easement for perimeter encroachment because you're excluding the fee owner from the use of the property. And it's very hard to get adverse possession. You have to prove a bunch of different things, but one of them is the payment of taxes. And that can be tough because usually your tax bill is based on the legal description that's in your deed. Like I said, it can be done, but it's hard. So it's the hardest type of encroachment to fix by going to the courts and trying to get it legitimized through unwritten rights. Like building encroachments, courts are generally hesitant to give an easement for perimeter encroachments, for fences and walls. Again, for the reason I mentioned, a perimeter encroachment excludes the fee owner from using his own property. So most courts will not give you an easement for that. However, perimeter encroachments are the most likely of the four types of encroachments to succeed in a claim of adverse possession. So if you can prove payment of taxes and the other required criteria, a perimeter encroachment is the most likely to get you what we call fee title through adverse possession. So unlike the other types of encroachments, which will more likely get you a prescriptive easement, a perimeter encroachment will be more likely to get you actual ownership of the underlying ground. Perimeter encroachments are typically the most easily discovered, either by a landowner or a contractor or by a surveyor. So, I get phone calls, landowners or some contractor they hired will go pull a tape measure between walls or fences and realize something doesn't match the tax assessor map or the deed or the survey, and they realize they've got a problem. So that's not typically how the other three types of encroachments work. But if you are a landowner and you have a measuring tape and you've got a fairly big perimeter encroachment, you can usually figure that out without necessarily having to have a surveyor. And perimeter encroachments are also the most easy of the encroachments to fix without some kind of court action. So you can move a fence, you can move a wall. If it's just a barbed wire fence, that's fairly easy, right? You can move that in a day most of the time. Other types of fencing and block walls are a little bit harder, but it's not like trying to move a building or an underground utility. So in that sense, from a practical point of view, perimeter encroachments are typically easier to fix without going to court than the other type of encroachments. Okay, the second type of encroachment we want to talk about is utility encroachments. That's when you have some type of utility feature that crosses the property line, oftentimes without an easement. That is like a sewer line or a water line or an irrigation ditch or an overhead telecommunications line, as an example. These types of encroachments are the most likely to result in a prescriptive easement. And there's some different reasons for that, but courts tend to be a little more sympathetic to utility companies, and other people are probably benefiting from the utility service that's provided by the utility that encroaches. And they just, by their nature, they're a little easier to get prescriptive rights for. So we do tend to see more prescriptive easements given for utility encroachments than any other kind of encroachment. They are, from a practical perspective, I would say they are the second most difficult to fix after buildings. So, buildings are really hard to fix from a practical perspective, building encroachments. Utility encroachments are kind of the second level down. So, not easy to move an overhead utility line or to move a big underground utility feature, pipe, or conduit. That gets very expensive very quickly. So they're a challenge there. And then one of the things that makes them different from perimeter encroachments, for example, is they happen even sometimes with good boundary management. So even if you have a good survey and your property corners are set, utility encroachments happen, right? The phone company's out, they're putting in a new pole for the neighbor. You're just not thinking about it, right? You're just not thinking about it. So that it does happen a lot, just because utility maintenance and construction is more routine, and a lot of those utilities are underground where you can't see them. In fact, the utility company could do what they call horizontal jack and bore. They could actually bore underneath your property from a neighboring property. You would never even know it happened, potentially. All right, so the third type of encroachment is building encroachments. So what make building encroachments different from the other three types? They are the most expensive to fix, almost always. People don't like to move buildings. Buildings are hard to move. They are the second most likely to result in a claim of adverse possession. And that's because you could potentially prove in a court dispute that a lot of the assessed value that you're paying taxes on is in the building. And if the building's significantly over the property line, you can argue that you were paying taxes on that value. So it's your second best shot at making a claim of adverse possession successful in court. This is, again, not easy to do, but it can be done. And this is another type of encroachment like perimeter encroachments that probably won't happen if you're doing a good job of boundary management. So if you have your property surveyed, the property corners are set, and you're watching what the neighbors are doing, they're probably not going to get a skyscraper on your property, right? So we most frequently see building encroachments happen when people haven't been careful, right? There haven't been surveys, monuments haven't been set, and people aren't paying attention to the neighbors' construction projects. Okay, the last type of encroachment is access encroachments. And they are the second most likely to result in a prescriptive easement if you go to court. So they come after utility easements. So, there's a good chance in California, if the access has been in place for longer than 5 years and you meet the other criteria, that you're going to get you or your neighbor will get a prescriptive easement for it. It's also, for some reason, the second most contentious. So people really like to fight over access encroachments. So, they will dig trenches, put up gates, plant landmines. They will do all kinds of really crazy stuff to keep people from using a driveway or an access road or things like that. So they tend to be contentious. They also are the second most frequently occurring. So after perimeter encroachments, access encroachments are the second most common. And a lot of that's because, people sometimes just don't think about, do they have legal rights for the driveway or for the road? A lot of roads are private, and people don't realize that, and so you can get into tricky situations. So that's the second most frequent type of encroachment that we see. The other thing is, access encroachments can have a huge impact on the use and value of the property. So if you have a couple parties are fighting over an access easement and it ends up being determined that a parcel is landlocked, that can have really huge implications on the value of that property. Now, you can go to court and argue things like easement by necessity or equitable easement or estoppel, but it's hard to do. And a parcel that's landlocked is worth a lot less than a parcel that isn't landlocked. So, squabbles over access encroachments become really important. So now you know the differences between The 4 types of encroachments, again, perimeter encroachments, like a wall or a fence, utility encroachments, like for a sewer line or a telecommunications line, building encroachments, and access encroachments. You know what makes them different, you know what makes them similar, and you'll be more prepared to deal with a boundary encroachment when it comes up on a commercial real estate transaction. Remember to stay out of this mess. What do you want to do? Get a survey, monument your boundaries, make sure you're building in the right spot, make sure your neighbors are building in the right spot, make sure the utility company's building in the right spot, right? Protect your property rights.